This thesis is called No Leg to Stand On, Gender Differences in the Stand-Up Comedy Material of Successful Male and Female Comedians. And I got the title from a feminist scholar that I feel speaks to my findings. It says, stand-up comedy involves taking a stand. Women often have no leg to stand on. So it addresses two different research questions. The first one is whether or not there are actual differences in the material in my sample. And the second one addresses what possible explanations I can offer for the causes and implications of those differences. So before I delve into how I address these topics, I want to describe what motivated me to pursue this thesis. I found that there's a widely held conception that women aren't funny, and these are the top 5 Google search results I got just by typing in the words women and funny. And as you can see, all 5 are dealing with the concept of women not being funny. To further investigate, I looked online for top 100 charts of the best comedians and found that the small minority of the women listed on them, well, the women were the small minority, with the most having 13 out of 100 women. And 2 of the 3 charts had most of the women in the bottom half of the rankings. Most of the theories that deal with why there are so few women in comedy address the fact that comedy and joke telling are interconnected with authority and taking control and power. And for women to assume that role is an act of subverting gender norms, and it's less acceptable and it makes people uncomfortable. And this aligns pretty well with what I found in my thesis. So why does this even matter? Well, it's important for women to be represented in all aspects of the media and in authoritative positions, but I think it's particularly important for them to be represented in stand-up because it is so connected with authority and control and influencing norms. Furthermore, marginal perspectives have more subversive potential because stand-up comedy sanctions the public expression of unique perspectives that are usually silenced. Therefore, it's important for women to play an equal part in stand-up to take advantage of the authority and influence that comes along with it and to challenge gender inequality. So to speak more about how stand-up plays a role in influencing gender norms and influencing social norms, I got this idea from a foundational piece for my thesis called Cultural Mediation, which posits that usually when stand-up comedians tell jokes, they're either telling culturally subversive jokes, which means that the jokes are challenging the way we think and subverting social norms, or culturally reinforcive jokes, meaning that they're eliciting laughter by emphasizing shared experiences and opinions and reinforcing social norms. And this is done through 3 different roles: the licensed spokesperson role, the shaman role, and the negative exemplar role. And I'll describe these roles in more depth when I talk about how I coded my data. So in sampling, I use success as a major sampling criteria, and I define success through social media indicators. So I looked at Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and IMDb, and found 5 successful female comedians and 5 successful male comedians. In coding my data, I focused on 4 aspects that were derived from my data, which are the topics that were discussed in each joke, who or what was targeted, the type of humor used in each joke, and which comedic role was assumed. When coding for targets, I categorize each target as either oppressed, neutral, or non-oppressed. For example, if a joke is targeting a woman, the target is coded as oppressed, but if a joke is targeting a man, it's coded as non-oppressed. So to talk a little bit more about how I coded my data and what all these roles mean, the licensed spokesperson role is assumed when there's a dominant social norm that's being subverted in the joke. So here's an example. I've been divorced for 5 years and it's been the best part of my life. I love being divorced. Every year has been better than the last. And by the way, I'm not saying don't get married. If you meet somebody, fall in love and get married, and then get divorced because it's the best part. So it's coded as being culturally subversive through the licensed spokesperson role because it's challenging the dominant norm of marriage being a legitimate institution. It's also coded as discussing relationships with the subtopic of marriage and divorce, as being observational and personal experience humor, and as targeting the neutral target of marriage. So an example of a joke told from the shaman role, and the shaman role is telling culturally reinforcing jokes by reflecting on shared experiences and opinions, is this one right here. I've been doing a lot of traveling. I just got back from Vegas, yeah. Everywhere you go, there's just bros in Vegas. Like Vegas, yeah, too many bros. Can you hear these guys bragging? This guy's like, yo, I had sex with a prostitute last night, bro. Okay, bragging that you had sex with a prostitute is like bragging you had some Doritos from the vending machine. There's no skill involved. So this joke was coded as being culturally reinforcive or being told through the shaman role because it draws on a dominant gender stereotype that's held about a certain type of man. It's also coded as discussing a specific male gender stereotype and male sexuality, as being social observation, and as targeting a specific type of male. Finally, the last role that I coded for was the negative exemplar role, which is assumed when a comedian portrays themselves as a character that's distant from who they genuinely are by being offensive. And this could either be subversive if it's used satirically, or it could just be offensive, but in a non-threatening way if it's just used to be shocking. People always assume I'm a bleeding heart liberal. What? I'm a conservative on almost all the key issues. I hate the poor. I've said that forever. We need help. Yeah, we've heard. And some of you know I have a charity, but I do that for tax purposes. If you're not familiar with it, it's called Febrezing the Homeless. So this joke was coded as being told from the negative exemplar role because Daniel Tosh doesn't actually Febreze homeless people, or I hate them. It's coded as discussing poverty and politics as being incongruous humor and as targeting explicitly poor people, but implicitly the comedian themselves. So to address my first research question of whether or not there are actual findings of material differences, I found very drastic differences in all the aspects of comedy that I looked at. To address the second research question of what possible explanations exist for those differences, I found that 3 interrelated elements can be used to explain why those differences are there. The first one is that male comedians and men in general are given more authority to speak on a wider range of topics with more legitimacy. This is connected to the second thing I found, which is the fact that the male perspective is commonly associated with the universal or the human perspective, while the female perspective is seen as the marginal or the other perspective. Finally, this leads to the third explanation, which is that it is less acceptable for women or female comedians to be subversive or tell subversive jokes. So my first specific finding is that the content of that the female comedians performed often did not require the claiming of authority, and I found this in all of the aspects that I analyzed. In terms of topics, female comedians most commonly discussed topics that were related to femininity. In terms of targets, they most commonly reinforce social hierarchies by targeting oppressed groups and themselves. In terms of what roles they assumed the most authoritative role least often, while assuming the least authoritative role most often. And in terms of the types of humor they use social commentary, which is arguably the most authoritative type of humor, 5 times less than male comedians, while using cultural references, arguably the least authoritative type of humor, most often overall, and twice as much as male comedians did. Another specific finding, which I just mentioned, was that they tend to focus on topics that are related to femininity. So for example, they discuss the body and sexuality twice as often as male comedians did. And they discuss popular culture, which is commonly associated with women, 1.62 times as much as male comedians did. At the same time, male comedians tended to focus on topics that related more to the human perspective. So they discussed relationships, including friendship and human experiences, 5 times more than female comedians did, and had higher rates of frequency for discussion of almost every other topic than women did. Finally, my last finding is that female comedians tended to perform less subversive humor. And the most notable finding that gave evidence to this is the fact that they assumed the role that was associated with subversive humor, the licensed spokesperson role, least often overall and half as much as male comedians did. They assumed the negative exemplar role, which is associated with portraying oneself as non-threatening, most often overall and 13% more than male comedians did, but only 15% did they do this satirically, which is when it's used subversively. And in terms of in terms of targets, they tended to reinforce social hierarchies. So they targeted oppressed groups twice as much as male comedians did, and most often overall. They targeted themselves 13 times more often, 13% more often, and other women twice as often. And when they did this, they were usually targeting women's bodies, and 75% of the time they were doing that, they were usually criticizing women's bodies. Finally, they targeted non-oppressed groups least often overall, and 6% less than male comedians did. So all of this leads me to conclude that these distinctions and the fact that there are so few successful female comedians in stand-up is that stand-up does involve claiming authority and subverting norms, and that is still considered the subversion of gender norms for women to a certain extent. And so the women that do claim authority during their stand-up performances don't tend to reach that level of success, and those that do reach that level don't tend to claim that much authority. So, thank you.
I've had much of an opportunity to talk with Juliana. We have all the members of the committee begin with whatever issues, questions, or whatsoever. Can I get us down?
First, I want to say that I really enjoyed reading your findings. They're really interesting. You did a nice job of presenting some pretty complicated and presentation really good as well. Laying out the findings and what has been done. Question, I guess what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about, maybe you talk a little bit more about cultural mediation, which is what the concept means. I think it's an important idea, but it's sometimes a little hard to grasp what's being mediated. Mediation usually means that there's like conflicting things that are being mediated. So how do you understand that process of cultural mediation? What do you think is being mediated in the stand-up performance?
I did have, it is a complex topic, and I did need to read it a few times to fully understand it and apply it. But I think the whole mediation part of it comes in when you think of how much of a social process stand-up is, and the fact that each segment being performed is met with either affirmation or just complete, like, rejection. So there's always something being put forth, and then it's either, like, accepted or rejected, which I think that's why it's not like some, political leader just like saying it how it is, but it really is an interaction between the audience and sort of like the leader of the audience kind of negotiating what's accepted and not accepted. I think that's like a major part of what that concept is.
So, but the negotiation on the part of the stand-up comedian is, you could see it simply as, well, if they say the right thing and the audience responds positively, it's really not the stand-up act that's doing the mediation, but just presenting and that the audience says, one way to see it, the audience says, yes, that's cool, no, we don't like that. But it sounds like cultural mediation means that there's a little more real negotiation back and forth. How does that show up in the performance?
Yeah, I guess it's also a lot about, it's not just about like stating something that the audience accepts, but it is a lot about the roles that are mentioned and how those roles are assumed and how methodically a comedian can present something so that it is accepted by the audience. And that's where the power derives. It's not, anyone can just like go up on stage and say something and have it be accepted. But it's a lot about how out there what you're saying is, and despite that, how willing people are to accept that. And why is that? I feel that plays like a big part of it. It's not like as simple as like, you'll find this funny if you agree with me, and then, yeah.
Do you have a favorite stand-up moment as an example of that, where the performer
but like Louis C.K. has like a section at the end of his stand-up where he's just like of course we shouldn't like we should adapt to people's peanut allergies. Like we shouldn't, like we should label all the peanut stuff and stuff. But maybe if we just close our eyes for like a couple of days, peanut allergies wouldn't be a problem anymore, or something. Like he does that like 5 times. Like, of course the Holocaust was a horrible, and then he's like, but maybe, a lot of medical advances wouldn't have happened in Ebola. And like he gets away with it because he's so methodically like presents himself as already sort of I wouldn't say deficient, but like a offensive sort of out there person that he's allowed to say those things, and that's what's meant in the piece by being given the cultural license to say them, to be the cultural spokesperson.
And what do you think the effect is there of mediation? What do you think he's accomplishing, other than just getting away with saying weird things?
It makes people like admit that they think that sometimes. Like I feel like it just makes people like explore that area of their mind that they don't let themselves go to, because he's doing it for them and they're just sitting back and letting him do it for them, kind of. And it pushes the boundaries of how they think.
So the mediation may in some ways be between things that are actually in the culture, but something that we don't really necessarily see and what brings it out.
Yeah.
We don't want to acknowledge formally, right? Even it's there, we see it, but we don't want to acknowledge it. I think that was part of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, he was quite brilliant. First time I saw him, I thought, wow, this guy's really offensive. But it's very subtle.
He's also very socially conscious too.
First of all, I enjoy reading Thesis, and then it became a long reads when you first said
Yeah.
it. So that was wonderful to see. It was great to see how you were able to portray I have a related question in terms of the audience, right? So I wanted to know if you could talk a little bit more about how different audiences might be perceiving this, right? Because if we're talking about cultural mediation, right, it seems like there's an assumption that there's a singular audience that has the same kind of frame through which they're viewing the performance, right?
Yeah.
But potentially, and particularly also looking at the comics that you have, right, potentially they may be speaking to different audiences simultaneously or at different times. So I wanted you to talk a little bit more about the audience and how can we complicate the audience and how that might complicate the performances. That's that question.
Okay. Yeah, the element of the audience was something that I struggled with during my coding, because in coding whether or not each joke was culturally subversive or not, I used like the dominant cultural frame, or what I perceived it to be, as a reference, and because these are mainstream audiences. But there's a lot of comedians that have very specific audiences that if their content was like shown to mainstream audiences, it wouldn't be accepted. For example, Margaret Cho tells jokes about being like queer or having fluid sexuality, and I feel like that just wouldn't be understood in like a very mainstream audience. So I took that into account sort of when coding by as I said, jokes can be, I coded those jokes as both culturally reinforcive, because they did reinforce the norms that were being held in the audience of if you have an audience of queer people mostly, which Margaret Cho does, and culturally subversive because she is sort of speaking for them in a way, saying things that they would normally not be comfortable saying to people that they meet, So, but I did struggle with that. All audiences are different, and I'm just, kind of neutralizing them. But I also think, all of these comedy specials, they're televised and they're well known. So it goes beyond the audience in the room, which I think also plays a role.
So potentially, thinking about what you just said, so potentially these comedians could take on multiple roles.
Oh yeah,
at the
and they
same
did
time.
a lot of the time. Yeah.
And then the other question had to do with, and I think you were getting at this when you talked about the very fact of women being stand-up comics as a person, right? It seems like, particularly in the beginning, in the introduction, it seems like when you were talking about women as stand-up comedians, it seems like you were talking about their perspective or some of the jokes that they are talking about during their sketches or during their performances as just assuming less authority. And it seems like I wanted to hear more of, and I wonder if you saw this even if you didn't see this at all, right? But I was wondering if, again, the very fact of that taking up space is a corrective, right? So it didn't seem like there was a corrective to women being excluded, right? So that the very fact of them taking up space and talking about female issues is not necessarily them taking less authority, but it's about them claiming space, right? And claiming and really challenging the ways in which that particular perspective has been excluded.
Yeah.
And it seems like you were getting at that in the end when you were talking about the very act of being a stand-up comic as a woman being subversive, right? But I wondered if there was more to that, right? And the fact of talking about female issues is actually a corrective, right? To the fact that those issues are not necessarily talked about or those things can be silenced, right? So
Yeah.
I wondered if there was any evidence of that. Perhaps there's none, right? So I'm not saying that that's what it is, but I'm asking.
Yeah. One of the things I was worried about was that my thesis was claiming too harshly that stand-up comedy is harmful when performed by women, or it's not subversive at all. And I did find many examples of women just sticking it to all these beliefs that people hold and just telling it from their perspective. But I took into account when talking about things like sexuality or the body or anything else that I said was associated with femininity, how exactly they discuss those things. And so, for example, when discussing the body, were they being body positive? And when discussing female bodies, were they criticizing the female body, or were they, praising it or whatever? So I found that, for example, there were more sex positive jokes than there were sex negative jokes in terms of when they discussed sexuality, which I thought was awesome. It was pretty cool. But I found most of the time when they discussed things that were associated with femininity, it was in a way that sort of reinforced the beauty standard and norms about how women talk about other women or how women talk about themselves or these different topics. But I definitely found some subversive humor in the content of female movies.
Excuse me, what I'm hearing, Mika, what I'm hearing you say is, on the other hand, even if they're talking about that reinforcing of femininity, the point is the fact that they're talking about femininity in a public venue it's already challenging when you have 5 out of 100 comedians be female. So the presumption would be the other 95 are not going to be talking about femininity in the same way that these women kind of. That in itself, even if it reinforces social codes, it's presenting a vision that otherwise wouldn't exist.
Right, and it's not necessarily, and I get what you're saying, you want to see what they're saying, right? You don't want to just assume that just because it's there, it's subversive, right? I totally get that, but exactly.
But even if it is not subversive, it exists. Otherwise it wouldn't. So it has kind of a somewhat subversive character just by existing in the public.
or it offers a possibility
Mhm.
for subversion just by existing.
Yeah.
If it wasn't there, then that possibility was.
Yeah, I definitely agree.
I think that of all the coding challenges, that's probably the biggest one. I can figure out what's subversive and what isn't. So much humor is both,
Yeah.
depending on, how you tilt your head.
Right. That was my biggest challenge.
And sometimes I suspect its success depends on being both, because then you can make everybody laugh. I remember when, all the critics wrote about sort of groundbreaking TV series All in the Family, where, I don't know if you've ever seen any of those old episodes, but in the history of television, it was a very dramatic thing, because the lead character, Archie Bunker, was this racist, sort of the stereotyped working class man with a son-in-law who was, peacenik hippie, and Archie Bunker became this character that everybody loved to hate, and people on both sides of the issues loved the show because, on the one hand, it made fun of this kind of character. At the same time, he was saying things that some people, that, like him, enjoyed hearing. So it had this ability to kind of speak across the spectrum, even though you could argue, that it was a critical, subversive perspective. In some ways, it actually, in other ways, reinforced some of the stereotypes and provided an expression in that, huge public domain of television. Some very complicated social issues. But it's often the case that the most popular comedy is the most ambiguous. But in thinking about your analysis, it makes a lot of sense to me as I think about just sort of off the top of my head, the comedians that I'm familiar with. I think it's often the case that the female comedians that stand out are, in part, in my mind, subversive simply by the fact of being female stand-up comedians. And then I try to think about, well, what is it about their performance that's directly subversive? And that's a little more difficult. Compared with what I think of in the history of male comedians, that I've always thought of as having a sort of overt subversive role, like from Lenny Bruce to Dick Gregory to Richard Pryor, the introduction of obscenity, to language into stand-up acts, which was always there kind of in the club acts, but then when it started to be recorded and disseminated, it was a big issue. And, a lot's been made, as you probably read about Lenny Bruce, about his sort of groundbreaking comedy. So there's this sort of long history that's become a kind of standard narrative about stand-up comedy, about how subversive this kind of stand-up acts have always been. So it makes a lot of sense to me that the incursion of female performers into this world would sort of take up that tradition, but have to find a sort of appropriately feminine way to invade that world, and do it in more subtle ways. But you're right, some of them are totally out there, but a lot of times it's a very subtle performance compared to the male.
Yeah. And I think subtlety is like the main difference, is that they tend to be more satirical. Like, for example, Sarah Silverman plays, and Joan Rivers, they both play like characters that are completely different from who they are. And a lot of the times I was just like listening to them and being like, are they joking or are they being satirical? But when male comedians do their, thing, this is explicitly challenging whatever norm that they're addressing. For the female comedians, it's more like it could go either way, and that ambiguity, I feel like, puts them in a safe zone at times.
So in terms of the methodology, thought at all about how you might do a study like this to get at some of that ambiguity, you know, from a methodological standpoint?
I have thought about it because the ambiguity was driving me crazy when I was coding. And I was sending Sarah jokes. I'm just like, what do you think about this? But I guess the one thing I would do to address the ambiguity is either address it through comedian intent, so try to find out what the comedian's intent was by maybe researching interviews or whatever, or audience perception, and maybe I would do that by like having 5 people or more look at the joke and fill out a survey, and then just have like, do you think this joke challenged whatever, and then check it off and see, and not leave it to me. Basically, is what I would do.
Yeah, that would be interesting.
Yeah.
Have 5 other people apply your coding system.
Yeah.
You know, train them. This is what you're trying to get at, and set them loose to do what you did, to see how much
Intercoder reliability. I probably would have a very low intercoder reliability.
which would be really interesting. And do you think there would be gender differences among the coders?
Maybe, yeah, that would be interesting too.
If you actually have a very diverse population, I don't know in terms of gender, but also other racial ethnic identities, you might get very different responses to.
Yeah.
When I was reading it, the people in my mind are like some more and in those